let's talk about the rail strike because that is looming on the horizon, and I think it's gone a little bit underreported. So I want to bring that up here. So just as a little bit of background, I think something like over 100,000 railroad workers are currently weighing a strike. I believe last month, something like 99.5% of the union membership voted to authorize a strike. So maybe Paul, why did 99.5% of railroad workers vote to authorize a strike? What got them to this point? And more importantly, what would the consequences of a national railroad strike be?
Yeah. So first the background is a little bit complicated. So basically, since 2020, the major freight rail companies and rail unions have been in contract negotiations. So these are not passenger rail like Amtrak, but the major freight rail that's carrying, industrial materials, things like that across the country. So there are 12 rail unions representing roughly 115,000 workers. And so for rail workers, also airline workers, their collective bargaining is covered by the Railway Labor Act, which is basically a process designed to make it as hard as possible for them to strike. So turns out the government is not that stupid. They realized very early on that our transportation system, especially rail and air, is really fundamentally critical to the economy, and they don't want to shut down. So basically, the Railway Labor Act really draws out and prolongs the procedures of collective bargaining. It also mandates that the government steps in to mediate before a strike is allowed. So basically, a month ago, they reached their end of their time to bargain. A mandatory 30-day cooling off period was called. President Biden stepped in to form the Presidential Emergency Board, or the PEB, and their job is to make recommendations for how to move forward. And so they recently released them. We can get to those later. But really, the main issues, I think, for rail workers are centering around their working conditions and their quality of life. Most rail workers are on call 24/7. They're working up to 19 hours a day. They really don't have vacation days or sick days. Even on days they're not working, they have to spend a lot of time waiting at terminals so they can get back home. So you can just imagine the kind of havoc this is going to wreak on a family life, on your personal life. And the railroads are increasingly short-staffed, partly as a result of a policy on the part of the companies to cut their workforce, try to squeeze more out of fewer workers, and also partly from workers leaving because the job has become unsustainable. To give one figure, in the last 6 years alone, in the major freight railroad companies, they've lost 45,000 workers. That's 29% of their total workforce just in the last 6 years. So, things like pay and benefits are an issue. They're always an issue, especially in this period of inflation. But it's really these scheduling and these working conditions that are at the heart of the crisis in the railroad industry. A lot of this can be traced back to a strategy the companies adopted called precision scheduled railroading, or PSR. And really simply, this is lean production for the railroads, figuring out how they can cut as much as possible from the workforce, how they can cut out routes that are unprofitable, how they can consolidate rail companies, cut corners on safety standards. And so this has been a disaster for workers, but surprise, they do it because Wall Street loves it. And we've had this absurd situation in the rail industry lately where, despite the quality of the companies has gone down, the amount of times they're delivering on time that has declined. They're cutting their workforce, but their stock prices have gone up. So I'll give one example. Union Pacific, one of the bigger freight rail companies, they've cut its workforce over the last 10 years from 45,000 to 30,000. They've had a decline in on-time deliveries. Their stock prices, dividend payouts have quintupled over that time period. So shareholders are getting very rich from this, strategy. They're spending most of their money on stock buybacks instead of investing in their workforce, investing in the infrastructure. And that's kind of leading to this situation today where these workers are on the brink. And, I could talk a little bit about the recommendations that have come from the government at this point.
Yeah, because it is kind of unusual that Biden or that the federal government has sort of intervened or become involved in these labor negotiations, right? So, you explained a little bit about why, about how that was mandated, but what is the status so far?
Yeah, so they've stepped in to provide recommendations, and really they're not very good. So the only kind of good thing was their wage recommendation. So they recommended 24% wage increases over the life of the contract, including back pay from 2020. If that is accepted, that is probably one of the better deals they've gotten in the last 30 years. But again, that's not necessarily the main issue for rail workers. So the recommendations do not do anything about sick leave, about scheduling policies, about crew size. So one big push from the companies has been to cut down from 2-person crews to 1-person crew. And just imagine, probably people have seen or gotten stuck, in front of or behind these huge rail cars going by. You have 200 cars attached, sometimes 2 to 3 miles long. And right now they're only two people manning those lines. And imagine if it's cut down to 1. That's what they're trying to push on. So these recommendations don't do anything about that. Also, the rail unions were pushing for a cap on their healthcare costs. And the presidential board, they recommended lifting that cap to up to 15% workers paying into the healthcare plan. So really, it does not address their major concerns. And the rumbling you're hearing from workers is they do not like this deal right now. So basically, from here, there is another 30-day cooling off period. Some of the rail unions members can vote on the agreement. Some of them won't. But basically, a strike could start on September 16th. And also remember that all 12 unions don't have to strike for there to be a shutdown. Back in 1992, that was the last time we had a rail strike. Only the machinists voted to strike, and that still shut down the rail system. You can imagine, all these workers are pretty essential. So even if a few of them or one of them voted to strike, that could be a shutdown. And then from there, it actually goes to Congress. So from there, Congress can intervene. They can actually try to force the workers back to work. And this is where it could get, I think, really interesting. Maybe Congress will be forced to try to present a deal that is better than what the board presented. They also have to weigh, do they really want to piss these workers off right before the midterms? Do they want to do that? Do they want to have a shutdown by the time of the midterms? So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how Congress plays it if there is a strike starting on September 16th. So there's really a lot still hanging in the balance. We should know by the middle of September what the next move is going to be from the unions, how members are voting on it, and then what it will be in Congress's court after that.
Yeah. So, of course, the last time you were on, we talked about the Teamsters gearing up for a big fight with UPS next year. And I think what kind of all of this boils down to is obviously transportation and logistics are incredibly significant, not just to the economy, but from a left perspective for challenging the power of the business sector and challenging the power of capital, basically. Help us understand, I guess, in broader terms, why the logistics sector is so important. What is going to happen if even just one of these rail unions goes on strike, and how can the left maybe leverage this for kind of larger political change?
Yeah, it would be a huge deal. So, right now, the majority of freight is moved by trucking, and the second most is moved by rail. And again, we're talking about industrial materials. So things that are fundamental to production, fundamental to construction are moved by these rail lines. And some of the supply chain issues we're already seeing have to deal with the rail industry. And some of these reforms, or quote unquote reforms they've done over the years, have actually made it more vulnerable, have made it a bigger issue with the supply chain crunch. The Port of Los Angeles has been really complaining about the rail companies and not really delivering stuff like they need to. So this would be huge in terms of, we're already in a supply chain crisis. A strike would exacerbate that, really put a chokehold on this economy. So this would be a really significant fact. This is why I think the government is going to do everything possible to avoid a strike. The question is, are they going to do it by taking a hardball stance, or are they going to feel the leverage from the unions and maybe try to get a better deal than was possible than before?
Right.
So I think for the left, there are currents in the rail industry, like Railway Workers United is a national caucus of rail workers who have been fighting on this. It really is a good example of just it doesn't take all the workers in this country to flex their muscles to make a huge impact. I mean, if 115,000 workers do it, I mean, it would just cause huge chaos in the society. But this is also a fight around privatization. I mean, this stems from the deregulation of the rail industry going back to 1980. This is a direct outgrowth of that. You know, we used to have around 500,000 workers employed in the rail industry, now 115,000 because of privatization and deregulation. So this is really a fight that the left should be getting behind and following closely.
All right. I want to shout out Paul's article on the railway negotiations. That's in Jacobin, and we will link that down below. Paul, good to see you as always. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.